When I first moved into the neighborhood, I believed I had finally stumbled into the kind of life I had always pictured. For years, I had endured thin-walled apartments, inconsiderate neighbors, and the constant chaos of city living. My new home was supposed to be different. A quiet cul-de-sac, neatly lined houses, tidy lawns, and the promise of space to breathe. I could roll my garage door open without the risk of someone blocking my driveway, and I could step out back to see a stretch of woods and trails that promised freedom instead of noise. One of the main reasons I had chosen this particular property was that wooded trail. It stretched out for miles, weaving through fields, dirt paths, and even connecting to some public riding areas. I had spent years saving for my ATV, a sturdy machine that I treated with the kind of care most people reserve for their cars. It wasn't the newest model, but it was mine, and every bolt on it was a reminder of hours worked, paychecks set aside, and sacrifices made. To me, it wasn't just a vehicle, it was independence. It was a piece of joy I had earned. The first few weeks in the neighborhood lulled me into a false sense of security. Neighbors smiled and waved when I drove by. Kids rode bikes up and down the sidewalks. On the surface, it looked like a perfect slice of suburban life. I had heard that the homeowners association was strict, but I figured that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. At worst, it meant people kept their lawns mowed and didn't let junk pile up in their driveways. I could live with that. That was before I met her, the HOA president. People didn't call her Karen to her face, of course, but the nickname floated around in whispered conversations and subtle eye rolls. I learned quickly why. She carried herself like she owned the entire neighborhood. Clipboard always in hand, pen poised like a weapon, lips permanently tightened into a line that said she was already displeased. She prowled the streets like a self-appointed sheriff, snapping photos of garbage bins left out too long or mailboxes that didn't meet her idea of community standards. At first, I ignored her. I figured if I kept my grass short, my house painted, and my driveway clean, she wouldn't have a reason to bother me. That was my mistake, assuming that staying out of her way would mean she would stay out of mine. The first sign of real trouble came on a Saturday afternoon. I had rolled my ATV out of the garage to clean it, check the oil, and gear up for a ride on the trails. The sun was shining, and for the first time all week, I felt like I could relax. A few kids in the neighborhood slowed their bikes as they rode past, their eyes wide with curiosity, but they didn't linger. That didn't bother me. What did catch my attention, however, was the teenager who strolled by later. She must have been 16, maybe 17. With a look on her face that made it clear she believed the world already belonged to her. She slowed when she saw the ATV, smirked, and muttered something I didn't quite catch. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just a teenager with an attitude. But the way her eyes lingered on my ATV made me uneasy. I would later learn she was Karen's daughter. Over the next week, I began noticing her more often. When I worked in my garage, she'd walk past slowly, her eyes glued to the ATV. Once, I caught her circling my driveway on her bike, riding in lazy loops as if testing boundaries. Another time, she actually stopped at the edge of the pavement, staring at the ATV like it was already hers, before smirking and pedaling away. Each time, I brushed it off. I told myself she was just a curious teenager. But the unease never left. The theft happened on a Sunday morning. I had been outside trimming hedges and pulling weeds, leaving the ATV parked in the driveway for just over an hour. It was broad daylight. Families were walking dogs, kids were playing, and neighbors were washing cars. When I came around the front again, the ATV was gone. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. I walked back into the garage, thinking maybe I had rolled it in without remembering. Empty. I scanned the yard. Nothing. The pit in my stomach grew heavier with every second. The ATV had been stolen. I didn't waste time. I called the police immediately. They arrived quickly, took down the information, and asked if I had any idea who might have taken it. I didn't want to make baseless accusations, but I couldn't shake the image of Karen's daughter circling my driveway. I mentioned her name carefully, framing it as a suspicion, not an accusation. The officer nodded but didn't say much. Later that evening, a neighbor came forward with footage from their security. The morning after confronting Karen was different. The air felt heavier, like the neighborhood itself knew I had crossed an invisible line. When I stepped out to collect the mail, a few neighbors who normally waved kept their eyes fixed on their lawns. It was as if they were afraid to be seen acknowledging me. That's when I realized Karen had already started her retaliation. HOA presidents don't need to shout to make their presence known. They control the flow of paperwork, the fines, the meetings. They have the power to turn your daily life into a series of headaches and inconveniences. And Karen wasted no time proving that. The first letter came within 48 hours. A violation notice, neatly typed and delivered in a bright white envelope with the HOA's seal. According to the letter, my trash bin had been visible for an extended period of time, past the designated pickup hours. The fine was minor, but the message was clear. I was being watched. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time, the complaint was about my lawn. Apparently, my grass was not uniformly trimmed and failed to meet community standards. I had cut it just 3 days earlier, and I knew it was immaculate. Still, the warning carried the weight of a fine if not corrected immediately. By the end of the week, I had received 4 violation notices. Trash, lawn, exterior paint, and even a complaint about my garage door being left open for too long. Each accusation was petty, but the frequency was impossible to ignore. Karen wasn't trying to enforce rules, she was trying to break me. And the neighbors? They stayed silent. Some avoided me entirely, while others gave me sympathetic looks when Karen wasn't around. It was obvious she had influence. She was the kind of person who could ruin lives with whispers, who could spin stories until the truth was buried under layers of rumor. But I refused to back down. I kept the footage of her daughter stealing my ATV backed up on 3 different devices. I kept records of every violation notice, every date, every ridiculous accusation. If Karen thought she could bully me into silence, she was wrong. What fueled my determination even more was the ATV itself. The police had confirmed the theft, but they hadn't recovered it yet. According to the officer assigned to my case, it had been spotted in another part of town but disappeared before they could act. That told me Karen and her daughter weren't just arrogant. They were bold enough to keep moving it around, confident no one would touch them. That confidence became clearer a week later. I had just stepped out to mow the lawn when I heard laughter echoing down the street. I looked up to see Karen's daughter and a group of her friends riding by on bikes, their phones out, filming. As they passed, one of them shouted a mocking comment about ATV rides. The group erupted in laughter. It wasn't just theft anymore. It was mockery, taunting, proof that they believed they were invincible. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in front of my computer, replaying the security footage again, studying every frame. I thought about Karen, about her smug smile when she told me her daughter was untouchable. And I realized something important. She wasn't just protecting her daughter. She was teaching her that rules didn't apply to her, that no matter what she did, there would be no consequences. But there was one thing Karen hadn't counted on. I was patient. And I was meticulous. The first step was gathering more evidence. I installed my own set of cameras, front yard, backyard, garage, and even a hidden one facing the street. If Karen or her daughter so much as stepped near my property again, I would have it on record. The second step was learning the HOA's rules as well as Karen did. I spent nights digging through the bylaws, reading every line, highlighting every clause. What I found was a goldmine. The rules were strict, yes, but they applied to everyone, including Karen. And the deeper I dug, the more I found evidence that she had been ignoring them herself. Fences painted the wrong shape. By the time the 3rd week rolled around, the petty violation letters had become part of my daily routine. Each morning, I'd step outside to find another envelope in my mailbox or taped to my door, each one more ridiculous than the last. Karen was relentless. She had cited me for having non-conforming, lawn edging for leaving my porch light on too long after sunrise, and even for failure to maintain uniform shrub height. It was laughable if it hadn't been so obvious that her real intent was to drown me in harassment until I gave up. But what she didn't understand was that I was keeping every single piece of paper. Each one was evidence, another brick in the wall I was building against her. The real problem wasn't the violation notices, though. It was her daughter. While Karen fought me with bureaucracy, her daughter seemed determined to make things personal. She became a constant presence in front of my house. If I stepped outside, she was there, riding her bike slowly, smirking, sometimes pretending to film me with her phone. Other times she'd bring her friends, and they'd sit on the curb across the street laughing loudly, tossing comments my way that I couldn't quite hear but knew were meant to taunt me. The worst part came when I realized she wasn't just mocking me. She was flaunting the ATV. It started with small things. A muffled engine in the distance, revving late at night. Scratches of tread marks that looked suspiciously like ATV tires cutting across a patch of grass near the trailhead. Then, one evening as I drove back into the neighborhood, I caught sight of it. My ATV, my machine. Karen's daughter and one of her friends were riding it down a side street, helmets off, laughing as if it were their personal toy. The sight made my blood boil. I slowed, rolled down the window and stared, but they didn't even flinch. Instead, her daughter looked directly at me, grinned, and revved the engine louder before speeding off. I called the police again, reported the sighting, and gave the officer the exact direction they had gone. But by the time a patrol car arrived, the ATV had disappeared. That's when I realized how dangerous the situation was becoming. It wasn't just theft anymore, it was reckless. She was joyriding through the neighborhood streets on stolen property, endangering herself, her friends, and anyone unlucky enough to be in her path. And Karen, she was enabling it. She was shielding her daughter from consequences, teaching her that laws didn't apply to her, but the cracks in their facade were starting to show. One evening, as I walked to the mailbox, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to before approached me cautiously. He glanced around nervously before speaking, his voice low. He said he had seen Karen's daughter riding the ATV near the trail entrance. He had even taken a photo from his phone but was too scared to share it publicly. He didn't want to get on Karen's bad side, nobody did. But he quietly emailed it to me later that night. The photo was grainy, but it was clear enough. Her daughter sitting proudly on my ATV, no helmet, no fear, a wide grin on her face. Another piece of evidence for my growing collection. By this point, Karen must have sensed that I wasn't breaking down the way she had hoped. That's when the intimidation escalated from paperwork to something more direct. One morning I woke up to find my car egged. The sticky mess dripped down the windshield, the stench unmistakable. Later that week, my mailbox was dented, struck hard enough to bend the metal. Then came the night when I heard loud bangs outside my house. I rushed out to find firecrackers tossed onto my driveway, scorch marks on the pavement. None of it was subtle. None of it was accidental. And while I couldn't prove it was Karen's daughter and her friends, the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. I installed more cameras. Not just around the house, but the mailbox incident changed everything. Until then, Karen and her daughter had operated with a smug kind of confidence. They believed the HOA's backing and the silence of the neighbors made them untouchable. But now, there was physical damage, proof of recklessness that extended beyond me. And more importantly, I had it all on video. The next morning, I filed a detailed police report. I handed over copies of the footage, the photo my neighbor had sent me, and the growing stack of HOA letters blaming me for crimes I hadn't committed. The officer who took my statement watched the video twice, eyebrows furrowed. He didn't say much, but the shift in his tone told me everything. The joyride had crossed a line from petty theft into reckless endangerment and destruction of property. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had once avoided me began to whisper, their eyes following Karen's house with suspicion instead of fear. The broken mailbox was a physical reminder that her daughter's antics weren't harmless fun. They were a danger to everyone. For the first time, I sensed the balance of power shifting. Karen, however, wasn't about to surrender quietly. If anything, she doubled down. By midweek, I received a formal summons to attend an HOA disciplinary meeting. The letter accused me of creating unsafe conditions within the community and warned that failure to comply with HOA demands could result in legal action, including liens against my property. It was absurd considering the evidence I had, but it was also classic Karen, using the HOA as her weapon of choice. I didn't panic. I prepared. On the night of the meeting, I walked into the community center carrying a thick folder of documents, photographs, and a flash drive containing the videos. Karen sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal board members. Her daughter wasn't there, but I could feel her presence in every smug glance Karen threw my way. The meeting began as expected, with Karen outlining a list of alleged violations tied to me. She spoke with authority, her voice dripping with self-righteousness as she painted me as a menace to the neighborhood. According to her, I was the reckless one, the one causing property damage, the one bringing disharmony to the community. But when she finished, I calmly opened my folder. I laid out the evidence piece by piece, photos of her daughter on my ATV, the neighbor's email, the violation letters that contradicted each other, and finally, the videos. Clear, undeniable footage of her daughter joyriding, destroying property, and endangering lives. The room went silent. Even her loyal board members shifted uncomfortably. They had expected me to fold, not to arrive armed with proof that turned the entire narrative on its head. Karen's face tightened, her composure cracking for the first time since this ordeal began. She tried to dismiss the footage as misleading, but her words carried no weight against the images playing on the screen. That night, I walked out of the meeting without a single fine, without a single penalty. For the first time, Karen had been forced into retreat. But victories against people like her are never final. 2 days later, I came home to find deep scratches down the side of my car. Not random scuffs, deliberate, malicious gouges running the length of the paint. My security cameras didn't catch the culprit directly, but the timing spoke volumes. It was retaliation, plain and simple. Karen couldn't silence me through the HOA, so now she and her daughter were lashing. The night of the crash echoed through the neighborhood long after the flashing lights were gone. People stood on their porches, whispering, replaying the scene over and over. The sound of sirens cutting through the cul-de-sac was not something anyone could easily forget. For the first time, Karen's daughter wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. She was a public danger, but Karen was nothing if not relentless. By sunrise the very next morning, she had already begun her campaign of damage control. I noticed the shift immediately. Neighbors who had been shaken by the crash now looked uncertain, glancing at me with hesitation instead of support. Word spread that Karen was telling a different version of the story. According to her, the crash hadn't been her daughter's fault at all. She claimed that I had harassed her family so intensely that her daughter had acted out of fear and desperation. The ATV? She called it a misunderstanding, saying her daughter had only borrowed it because she thought it was abandoned. It was absurd. Everyone had seen the accident. Many had heard the laughter, seen the reckless driving, and knew the ATV belonged to me. But Karen had a gift. She knew how to twist reality until people doubted what they had witnessed with their own eyes. Within days, she organized a special community meeting under the guise of addressing safety concerns. But it was clear what the real agenda was, to salvage her reputation and shift blame onto me. I attended. Of course, armed with the same folder of evidence I had carried before, now thicker with fresh footage of the crash. The room buzzed with tension. Some residents sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable. Others whispered in corners, waiting for the fireworks to begin. Karen took the floor first, her voice thick with emotion. She painted her daughter as a victim, a sweet, misunderstood girl, unfairly targeted by a neighbor who had it out for their family. She spoke about harassment, false accusations, and a hostile environment. She called the crash a tragic accident caused by stress rather than recklessness. Theatrics, all of it. When she was done, she fixed her gaze on me, daring me to respond. I rose slowly, placed the flash drive into the projector, and pressed play. The room fell silent as the footage rolled. There was her daughter, laughing as she tore down the street. There were the friends clinging recklessly to the ATV. And there was the crash, loud, undeniable, captured from multiple angles. Gasps rippled through the audience. Even those who had wanted to believe Karen shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I followed the video with a calm explanation. The theft, the harassment, the vandalism, the endless violation letters. Piece by piece, I laid out the timeline, each point backed by evidence. By the time I finished, the room was buzzing, not with sympathy for Karen, but with outrage. Karen's composure cracked. She raised her voice, snapping at me, at the board, even at neighbors who dared to ask questions. Her usual smirk was gone, replaced by desperation. She knew the walls were closing in. Still, she wasn't finished. In the days following the meeting, the harassment continued, though in subtler ways. My trash bin was mysteriously knocked over twice. A smear of mud appeared across my front steps. Anonymous notes were slipped into my mailbox with messages like, "You don't belong here," and "Leave before it gets worse." But the difference was clear. The neighborhood was no longer on her side. The night after her daughter's arrest, the neighborhood felt different. The air carried a hush, as though everyone was waiting for what would come next. People whispered on sidewalks, their tones cautious but edged with relief. It was as if a long collective exhale had finally been released, proof that Karen wasn't as untouchable as she claimed. But I knew better. Karen wasn't finished. By morning, she was back in full force. Where others might have hidden in shame, Karen doubled down. Her front yard sprouted handmade signs painted in bold letters. "False arrest, corruption in action, stop harassment." They weren't directed at the police, they were directed at me. Her campaign of revenge was personal. It started small. Another violation notice slipped under my door, accusing me of having improperly trimmed hedges. Then another about a garden hose left visible in the backyard. Then one claiming my house number wasn't illuminated brightly enough at night. All nonsense, all fabricated. The HOA board, already shaken by her daughter's arrest, was split. A few loyalists still clung to her, repeating her claims of bias and vendettas. But more than half the board had grown weary. The evidence against her daughter was undeniable, and Karen's constant outbursts had stained the HOA's image. Behind closed doors, they began discussing whether she should be removed as president. Karen must have sensed the shift, because her tactics escalated. Anonymous complaints flooded the HOA email inbox, all with suspiciously similar wording. Rumors began circulating that I was planning to sue the entire neighborhood and have the HOA dissolved. None of it was true, but gossip spread like wildfire. For every person who saw through the lies, another seemed to hesitate, unsure of what to believe. Then came the vandalism. One evening, I walked outside to find my mailbox smashed in. A few nights later, someone egged my garage door. On another morning, I discovered tire tracks carved into my front lawn, mud splattered across the grass. Each incident was petty, cowardly, but meant to send a message. I was under attack. I reported everything to the police, and though the officers were sympathetic, they admitted proving Karen's direct involvement would be difficult. Unless someone caught her in the act, the vandalism could be brushed off as random. But I knew better. Nobody else had a reason to target me. Nobody else was desperate enough. Meanwhile, Karen played the victim. At HOA gatherings, she stood tall, voice trembling with righteous indignation, declaring that she was the one being harassed. She claimed my campaign of lies had driven her daughter into trouble, that I had manipulated the police, that I was orchestrating a smear campaign. And though many rolled their eyes, some still clung to her words, unable to fully break free from the spell she had cast over the community for years. But cracks continued to form. The board scheduled a formal vote to review her status as HOA president. It was unprecedented in the neighborhood's history, an open challenge to her power. Karen fought tooth and nail to stop it, filing procedural objections, calling emergency meetings, even threatening lawsuits. But the date was set. In the week leading up to the vote, the atmosphere grew tense. The night after the HOA vote was eerily quiet. Karen's yard, usually lit up with security lights and scattered with handmade protest signs, sat dark. No movement, no shouting, no smug lectures drifting down the street. It should have felt like relief. Instead, the silence was heavy, like the pause before a storm. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen wouldn't simply vanish into the background. She wasn't built for that. She fed on control, on conflict, on the belief that she was untouchable. Losing her title as HOA president stripped her of that power, but it hadn't extinguished her fury, and I soon learned just how far she was willing to go. The first incident happened 3 nights later. My security cameras caught a figure creeping across my yard just after midnight. Dressed in dark clothes, hood pulled low, the person carried something bulky in their hands. They crouched near my front porch, fiddled with something, then darted back toward the street. By morning, the something was obvious. A bottle filled with gasoline, its ragged wick charred from a failed attempt at ignition, sat wedged beside my front steps. It was no prank. It was a message. I called the police immediately, forwarding them the footage. Though the figure's face was obscured, the posture, the build, even the hurried gait looked familiar. Karen. The officers didn't dismiss me this time. Between the destroyed ATV, the vandalism, the violation notices, and now this, her pattern was undeniable. They opened a formal case promising increased patrols around the neighborhood. But their warnings were clear. Karen was escalating, and escalation like this rarely ended quietly. The community was rattled. Neighbors who had once tolerated her antics now whispered about restraining orders, about selling their homes, about how far Karen might go in her crusade against me. Many avoided her altogether, ducking into houses when she emerged, refusing to answer the door when she knocked. But isolation didn't weaken Karen. It made her more desperate. She began appearing at my driveway, screaming accusations into the night. She'd call me a liar, a thief, a puppet master pulling the strings of weak neighbors. She'd insist her daughter was innocent, that I had ruined their lives out of jealousy and spite. I didn't respond. I didn't give her the satisfaction. But I kept every second on video, backing it up on hard drives, handing copies to the police. Meanwhile, her daughter's case wound its way through the legal system. What started as a misunderstanding, as Karen had called it, now looked like a pile of undeniable charges. Theft, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, trespassing, and thanks to the crash, an additional count tied to public safety violations. Each hearing pulled the daughter deeper into the system, despite Karen's furious protests outside the courthouse. The girl who once strutted around the cul-de-sac, bragging that she was untouchable, now shuffled in and out of courtrooms, head down, eyes darting nervously at the cameras. The final unraveling came one evening just as summer gave way to fall. I returned home from work to find flashing lights once again filling the cul-de-sac. This time, they weren't there for me. Karen had gone too far. According to police reports, she had stormed into a neighbor's garage, screaming accusations that they were hiding evidence against her. When the startled homeowner tried to push her back, she lashed out, scratching his arm and throwing a lawn chair into his car windshield. He called the police immediately, and this time there was no denying her guilt. She was arrested on the spot, wrists cuffed, face twisted with rage. The neighborhood gathered quietly as the patrol cars pulled away. No one cheered.